Now, to continue a little bit with my story, and I tell it so that all this teaching I'm doing doesn't come off simply as abstract. All this comes from experience, whether it's my own experience or working with students over the last 11 years. But it would be nice to be able to say after these two illnesses, the egoic structure had been dissolved. It wasn't trying to put itself together, and I was existing in the clear light of being at all times and in all situations. Unfortunately, I wasn't quite that karmically pure, apparently. There was much more to come. In fact, more than I ever could have imagined. And one of the biggest moments, something happened when I had my first awakening. And one of my teachers said to me, and at the time seemed very odd, I could tell my teacher was very, very happy about what had happened, had recognized that something very significant had happened to me. And yet in that same meeting, my teacher told me certain things to watch out for. And basically my teacher told me, here's ways that you can throw away what you've realized. Here's ways that you can avoid the truth that you've realized. Here's ways you can put yourself back to sleep. And when I say that, people always say, well, what were those? What were those? Tell me those. But my sense of it is my teacher was telling me ways that were very particular to me. They're not necessarily universal. And the funny thing was, my teacher told me about 4 or 5 things to watch out for, because doing these things could put me back into delusion. Only later, many years later, did I realize that every single thing my teacher told me might happen, everything my teacher told me, warned me about ways that I could put myself back to sleep, I'd actually done every single one of those things. I had forgotten what my teacher had told me, but remembered it many years later. And when I looked back, I was surprised, and I thought, wow, everything my teacher warned me of, I actually did, and I lived through it. And it wasn't that it was wrong to do that, because actually by living through it, I saw that it was very, very necessary in some ways to live through it. But the one thing that I want to talk about that was the most powerful was my teacher told me a very odd thing. My teacher said, be somewhat careful, because a lot of people at this stage will meet someone and they'll find someone, they'll go away with them, and they'll go traveling with them as a means to avoid themselves. And I thought, at the time, I thought, what on earth could that mean? That seems, so far-fetched and sort of specific, not only meeting someone, like falling in love with somebody and then going on a trip with them. And it just didn't seem to fit into my context at all. But years after that was when I was 25, and about 4.5 years later, lo and behold, I met a woman, and it was one of those relationships that some of you may have experienced, where the relationship is actually like Velcro, where everything inside of myself that was undone, everything inside of myself that was grasping or needy or addictive or unhealthy, fit perfectly with this person. Everything that they had inside themselves was unhealthy. And when we met, it was like Velcro. And the relationship was formed on some very unhealthy patterns. But basically what it was a lot of totally unconscious patterns that hadn't been seen through, that hadn't been dissolved, that hadn't been let go. And so I won't tell you the whole sordid tale of it, but the long and the short of it is this relationship was unbelievably difficult, and it pushed every single button that I had, and it pushed me in a way that I'd never believed I could be pushed before. I suffered through this relationship in ways that I could never possibly imagine suffering. And yet, at some point in it, it was a completely dysfunctional disaster. And I had become a total emotional wreck by going through it. And at some point, I realized this is insane. It took me some time to realize this, but I realized this is insanity. What am I doing? How did I get myself here? And how am I going to get myself out of here? And I started to realize something very important, that once again I had got myself there by not being totally truthful with myself, by letting desire and attachment and aversion too to pull me into this very destructive sort of relationship. And I realized that the only way to get out of it was going to be by being radically and deeply honest with myself, by taking total responsibility for where I had ended up. And what was seen was that the only way that I could actually do that was to totally let go of every image I had of myself. Because each image that I had of myself, whether it was a good person or a helpful person or a nice person or an awake person or a wise person or a stupid person or as a whatever, every image that I had was actually part of what had driven me into this situation. And the only way to get out of it was to start to let go of everything that got me into it in the first place. And mostly what got me into it were various ways that I was still perceiving myself on an egoic level, ways I wanted to perceive myself, the person I wanted to be. And the only way out of it was to really get honest and to really let go of all this. So like I said, I won't bore anybody with the sort of details of all that had happened. But through this process, it was an extraordinarily deep dissolving of the egoic self. It wasn't a dissolving like when you sit in meditation and have it dissolve into a wonderful sense of presence. It was more the kind of dissolving as if someone is just ripping layers off of you, one by one by one. It was very unceremonious, a very fierce form of grace. It wasn't nice, it wasn't kind, and it wasn't easy. It was existence shoving a mirror in front of my face and literally holding me so I could not look away for even a second. And this was probably, undoubtedly, the most difficult time of my whole life. And through this process, I finally had found a willingness to really let go of everything I thought I was, of every sense of self that could ever arise, whether it was a wonderful sense of self or a terrible sense of self, a helpful sense of self or an unhelpful sense of self. Literally by going through this experience, and not just going through it, but by finally becoming willing to be conscious, to allow it to wake me up, to sober me up. It was a version of sort of emotionally bottoming out. What I found was it was like I was being squeezed like a rag, and all sense of self was being squeezed out of me, very unceremoniously, and yet in a very difficult way, but also started to sense something amazing about it, is that I started to feel the inherent sense of freedom in this sort of squeezing out the karmic conditioning in my system. In the realization I had at 25, in the awakening I had, I realized I wasn't the body and mind and personality, all of that. I realized it was all a dream. But what I didn't realize is that even though you realize it's a dream, you still have to deal with it. And if the body and the mind and personality are there and they're still divided and there's still unmet, undealt with forces within it, that it's still going to have this gravitational pull to pull consciousness back into its domain and pull consciousness back into suffering. And so I saw that what's happening in the body and mind couldn't ultimately be avoided. Everything had to be dealt with. Everything had to be dealt with. Everything had to be seen through. If what was realized was to really be embodied, was really to be fully lived. And this process was one of the most important processes of my entire life going through this very difficult situation. And at the other end of it, it was like coming through those moments of being ill, or those illnesses when I felt once again of being nobody and nothing, not just on an absolute level, not just on an awakened level, but also on an embodied level as a human being, to really feel inside oneself, to be nobody, to be nothing as a human being, which may sound negative, but it's actually, when it's fully let in, is extraordinarily positive, humbling in the most positive and beautiful sense of the word.